Hi, everyone. Welcome to 3GNY Stories Live We Do Wednesday. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Gail Peck, 3GNY Vice President and grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors. This is our 24th We Do Wednesday, our virtual series that brings our educational initiative We Do from classrooms to your living rooms. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a support forum for the descendants of survivors. For tonight's event, we'll be featuring 3GNY's Treasurer and WEDU speaker, Steven Markowicz, who will share the story of his grandfather, Philip Markowicz. Tonight's program showcases 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, We Do, which is short for We Educate. We Do is a 4-week training program that empowers grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and with community groups. Education is more important and more urgent than ever, given the horrifying rise of anti-Semitism we see in the headlines on a daily basis. We know we need to keep doing this work as much as we possibly can. Studies have shown that students who receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They're more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more likely to be upstanders. Through our grandparents' testimony, we talk about the importance of stepping in early and often where small injustices are found, on the playground, in the classroom, and on the street, because it is the easiest and most efficient way to act. By the time the Nazi tanks roll in, it's too late. 3GNY has trained more than 375 speakers in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and around the country. We've spoken in more than 500 classrooms and have impacted more than 40,000 students and community members. And between our live programming and YouTube channel, more than 18,000 additional people have heard our stories. Hope is not lost, and we need to keep doing this work, now more than ever. You can help us accomplish this through a financial gift. This will go directly toward training more speakers, thus reaching even more students. We do not solicit donations from schools, teachers, or students. We provide our programming to schools completely free and aim to keep the cost of training to 3Gs as low as possible. There's a link with ways to donate in the chat, and we hope you'll consider making a gift. If you've already donated to us, thank you so much. You can sponsor an event or program in honor or memory of a survivor or loved one, and there are also corporate sponsorship opportunities available. Thank you again for being here tonight. You're helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never again is more than just an empty phrase. Tonight's event has been generally sponsored by the Berger family in memory of Simon Berger. To share some words about this remarkable man, I'd now like to introduce Talia Feldberg, Simon's granddaughter. Talia, we're so grateful for your family's generosity and commitment to keeping your grandfather's story and so many others alive.
Thanks so much, Gail. So I'll read the little thing I have here. And also thank you, 3GNY in general, for recognizing my grandfather in this way. I know he'd be really honored. He was deeply committed to Holocaust education, an area in which he was personally active for a number of decades. And I think this is indicative of several things about him. His civic mindedness, his high regard for education more broadly, his do-it-yourself attitude, his concern for the welfare of Jews both now and in the future, his immense capacity to connect with others, and of course, his fierce resolve that no one should ever again have to experience what he did. He was always very open about his life story, which included a happy childhood in a wealthy religious family of textile manufacturers in Lodz, Poland, an adolescence in the Lodz ghetto, and deportation to Auschwitz and later other work camps. Of his beloved family, father, mother, 3 sisters, 2 other brothers, he was the only survivor and one of very few in his large extended family. However, despite the enormity of what he had suffered and lost, he retained his determination and his capacity for love. It was only a couple of years after the war that he met my grandmother, Rita, also a survivor, with whom he remained madly and quite demonstratively in love for 75 years. Together, they rebuilt their lives. Nothing was more important to my grandfather than family, and he was passionately devoted to the 3 children, 4 grandchildren, including me, and 2 great-grandchildren they had together. He embraced my grandmother's large, tight-knit, extended family, becoming Uncle Simon to dozens of people across 3 continents. He was a pillar of both civic and Jewish communities in his beloved adopted home of Long Beach, New York, and he had a vast circle of friends and colleagues that spanned the globe. So my grandfather achieved a lot in his life, in addition to secondary to, he would want me to say, his relationships. His education stopped after 4th grade, but his innate intelligence, natural mechanical skill, world-class stubbornness, and intense work ethic not only helped keep him alive. He liked to follow up his wartime survival stories with a reminder to always do your best, but also brought him great success later in life. And I'll also just say in the work ethic, he loved to work. He was working until less than a year before he passed. And however, and this might be his greatest legacy, he most valued what he achieved for what it allowed him to do for others. He always talked about learning by example. He taught by example too. It's in this spirit that 3GNY felt like a fitting organization to suggest donations to after his passing. We know he'd be proud of how many people followed his example and gave in his name and of the work that it will support. And I just want to say quickly that, plenty of those donations were from my family, but were really from all kinds of people all over the place. So which is all to say, I think he'd be really proud of that, and just that he was someone who cared a lot about the future. I think you have to live the kind of life he did, and I know he'd want nothing more for his legacy than that it should keep contributing to a better future. So yeah, thanks again, and I know me and the other grandkids are excited to get involved in the future with you guys.
Great, thanks, Talia. Hi, everyone. I'm Bella, a 3GNY volunteer and a granddaughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. I've been involved with 3G for the past couple of years, and after completing the WEDU training last year, I've been fortunate to share my grandfather's story throughout New York. And my involvement really began as a way that I could honor my grandfather and keep his memory alive. And now more than ever, sharing these stories is essential. But being part of the 3G community has not only allowed me to share my family's story, but it has given me the opportunity to learn from fellow volunteers and their families. And now I'm excited to introduce you to Steven Markowicz. Steven is the treasurer of 3G New York and has been active since 2021 after completing WEDU. Continuing in the footsteps of his grandfather, Philip, and his mother, Hinda, Steven is passionate about telling the story of his family and their survival through the Holocaust, which is based on his grandfather's autobiography, My 3 Lives. Steven took on a leadership role in 2022 and has been focused on expanding the 3G New York reach into independent schools throughout New York City. Professionally, he's a CPA and a CFE, and after a long career as a forensic accountant, he's now a licensed real estate agent in New York City. Steven lives in Manhattan with his wife, Jana, and their 2 children, Gavin and Samantha. Steven, take it away.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Bella, Talia, and Gail for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the Berger family for sponsoring this event tonight in honor of Simon Berger. I actually wonder if Simon and Philip knew each other, because as you'll hear tonight, they were both in the Lodz Ghetto and Auschwitz as well. So I wonder if they knew each other. So again, my name is Steven Markowicz, and I'm a real estate agent in New York City. But my grandparents are both Holocaust survivors, Ruth and Philip Markowicz, who you see here as I remember them most. And today I'm going to tell you parts of my grandfather Philip's story of survival during the Holocaust, which he memorialized in his autobiography titled My 3 Lives, which documents his life before, during, and after the Holocaust. But before I begin, I just want to mention the Holocaust is unique. It was deliberately and carefully conceived, organized by men with doctorates and law degrees. It was the deliberate murder of 6 million European Jews, including 1.5 million children. And the majority of the world allowed it. So why am I telling this story? When I was young, my grandfather spoke not only to my school, but to many other schools in the Toledo, Ohio area where I'm from. And when it became too difficult to him to speak on the subject, as you can imagine, my mother, Hinda, took over and continues to tell my grandfather Philip's story to this day. With my kids, Gavin and Samantha, becoming of age to learn about the Holocaust, I decided it was time for me to get on board as well. And with time passing, more and more people are not only forgetting, but disputing that the Holocaust even happened, or using it as a comparison, to which there is none, by the way. So with that, I'm going to go a little bit out of order and start with Philip's third life, which began after the war. Philip and Ruth moved to Toledo, Ohio to start, and Philip started a successful television appliance business, and they built a very good secular life together. These are some pictures of my grandfather. So on the left, my grandfather with his 3 grandsons, and on the right, my grandfather with all of his great-grandchildren at the time. And here's some older pictures of my grandparents with my family as well as my cousins. And if you look at the picture on the right, I'm that little boy on the bottom left in the overalls. And there's my grandfather relaxing on the balcony in Florida. And on the right, my grandfather and my father back in the 80s and 70s probably. And then my grandparents at my parents' wedding. And on the right, my grandfather at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And then finally, the beginning of his third life, my grandfather Philip on the left with his son, Alan, my father. And on the right, Philip and his wife, Ruth, with Alan on the train on the way to Bremen Port before leaving for America. And while I have plenty of beautiful pictures of Ruth and Philip once they came to America, life was a lot different for them in the 1930s. They lived regular lives and were involved in their Polish communities, but their lives were changed due to one single fact. They were Jewish. So let's jump back to Philip's first life before the war. So here's a map of Europe, and if you can see, I've circled Poland, which borders Germany to the west and the former Soviet countries to the right. And so Philip was born in 1924 in a small village in Poland called Przerab, which is about 50 miles south of Lodz, the third largest city in Poland. And you can see on the map here, I've marked it by that red dot. So this village was at the center of 5 surrounding villages that were much the same. Philip's father was a Gur Chassid and was the district rabbi, which effectively meant that he led the entire Jewish population of his village as well as the 5 surrounding villages. Philip had 3 siblings, an older sister named Sivia, and 2 brothers, Herschel and Henry. The family was extremely religious, strictly observant, and Jewish education, Torah or Bible study, was of extreme importance. In fact, Philip began his study of Torah at the age of 5 with his father. The family lived fairly well for the village in a house with a thatched roof, perhaps like the one in this picture here. You know, they had what they needed, but the village in 1930s was simple. You know, no electricity, no running waters, dirt roads. You know, there was only one phone in the entire village. Only one person owned a car, and the bathrooms were outhouses in the backyard. And Philip experienced anti-Semitism on a regular basis while growing up. People used to say things to him like, "Dirty Jew, wait till Hitler comes, then we'll teach you a lesson." People would throw rocks at them, and Philip used to get into fights all the time to defend himself. In fact, it got to a point where Philip's father couldn't walk anywhere alone, or he'd be beaten up. And Philip and his brother Henry would have to walk with him to protect him. When he was 14, he continued his study in a town called Przerab in Poland, which you can see on the map here, is only about 8 miles away from his village, Przerab. He went to school at a shtibel, which was a private religious school strictly supervised from a religious perspective. So there's a couple other pictures here. On the top right is actually a picture of the village back at that time. And on the bottom right is a picture of what was called the Wooden Synagogue, built in 1760 and unfortunately later burned by the Nazis. So Philip was there for several months, and in 1939, there was a lot of talk about the potential war with Germany, but no one really thought there would be another war. But one morning he awoke and there was a lot of commotion in this marketplace, usually bustling with people selling food and goods for the day. Instead, soldiers were running about, people were running about, frantic. It was September 1st, 1939, and Nazi Germany had invaded Poland. World War II had begun. Philip was 15 years old at this time. Thus began Philip's second life, survival. So that evening, he took the only bus going north back to his village in Przerab, where he and his family thought they would be safe. Why would the Nazis come to his small village? But soon as the Nazis arrived and tanks rolled through the village, they took control and began tormenting the Jews, especially Philip's father, because they knew he was the one in charge. They beat him up, they shaved his long beard. And finally, the family decided it was time to leave. And under the cover of night, Philip and his family left in secret by horse and wagon and went 50 miles to Lodz to live in his sister Tsivia's tiny apartment at 48 Legionnaire Street. Here's a map just to show you that distance, and you can imagine how long it took them to get there by horse and wagon. So Lodz was an industrial city, lots of factories. And in this picture, you can see kind of a lot of smokestacks in the distance. And soon, not long after Philip and his family arrived, the Nazis began making decrees or laws that the Jews had to follow. Week after week, new decrees. The first was that Jews had to wear the yellow Jude star like the one you see here on the front and back of their jackets. And these were made to humiliate the Jews and to mark them out for segregation and discrimination. It's easy to identify them, to beat them, to force them to do things. Then the Jews weren't allowed to ride in cable cars, which meant that they couldn't get around to work. Then they weren't allowed to own radios, which meant that they were unable to hear news updates about the war. Armed police would pillage Jewish properties. They would invade apartments, workshops, and stores of Jews, stealing things, taking everything of value, beating the owner. Even regular German people would do this without any repercussions. In November of 1939, all 4 of the great synagogues of Lodz were burned down. In fact, this is a picture of the remnants of one of those synagogues in Lodz. And, the Germans were just taking over everything. And then another decree in February 1940 that all Jews were required to move to the section of Lodz designated only for Jews, the Lodz Ghetto, 1.5 square miles with at least 160,000 people at its highest capacity. The photos you see here in this picture are of Jews moving their belongings to the ghetto, taking everything they could with them. Philip and his family were relocated to a small apartment at Zitnia Street, number 14. In late 1940, when Philip was 16 years old, the ghetto was sealed and isolated from the rest of the city. No one in, no one out. And a year later, in the spring of 1941, the Germans put double barbed wire fence around the ghetto. And the Gestapo, the Nazi police force, supervised security. Guards were placed every 50 to 100 meters, and it became, quote unquote, legal to shoot any Jew that approached the border. Often people were just shot for sport or boredom. There were many stories of an event called hunting for humans, which means shooting casual passengers without any provocation. As I mentioned, Lodz was an industrial city, and to survive the ghetto was effectively turned into a manufacturing hub for the Nazis. The factories, or sweatshops, I should say, would churn out war material and goods for the Germans. And in exchange, the Jewish community would receive tiny bits of food and basically be allowed to live. And as a result, the Lodz Ghetto became one of the largest slave labor camps during the war. In fact, it was so productive that it was one of the last ghettos liquidated. Even children were forced to work. If you were 8 or older, you had to work 10 to 12 hours a day. So the pictures you see here on this slide are a couple different textile factories and clothing factories. Sewing as well. Here's another clothing factory where people are doing various work. This is a wooden shoe factory. And finally, a woodworking factory. And Philip actually worked in a woodworking factory. He used to steal at the end of the day and take home the little scraps of wood that were left over and put them in his jacket to take home to his family, because it was so bitterly cold during the winter in Poland that just that little bit of extra wood could help to keep things warm or to help cook. So Philip would talk about how terrible life was in the ghetto. The supplies would dry up quickly. The food rations were getting smaller and smaller every day. And the Nazis were deliberately trying to starve people, only allowing them to buy small amounts of bread, potatoes, and fat. Overcrowding was common, and the plumbing if there was any, would break, and human waste and garbage was just thrown onto the street. And people were dying all the time from diseases such as tuberculosis, dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia. I mentioned the freezing temperatures and how cold it can be in Poland during the winter, and hunger. Unfortunately, Philip's father and his older brother died from hunger. And throughout this period, Jews were not only arriving in the ghetto, but each day hundreds of people would be deported or transferred out of the ghetto to another location. Philip didn't know where they were going, but he figured they were going to another working camp. In September 1942, when Philip was 18 years old and had been in the ghetto for 2 years, the German authorities ordered the elderly Jewish women and Jewish children to be resettled outside the ghetto. And what you see here is actually a picture of the announcement, number 391, about this resettlement. And unfortunately, that included Philip's mother and his sister's son, Philip's nephew. Now, this part of the story was always very difficult for Philip to talk about. He absolutely loved his sister, Tsivia, who was 14 years older than him. He adored her, and she basically raised her. In fact, I'm actually named after her. The Nazi police, the Gestapo, went door to door and took the women and children from their homes. Philip and his family tried to hide the little boy underneath the floorboards, but the Nazis found him and threw them into a wagon just like this. They took Philip's mother and nephew to the end of town and made them board a passenger train, exactly as you see in this picture from Lodz. Philip's sister, Tsivia, who was not selected, couldn't bear to be without her son. And so she forced her way onto the train, even though people were telling her not to, even though the Jewish police were telling her not to go. But she couldn't bear to be without her son. And I mentioned Philip wrote a book, and I'd like to read an excerpt from what he wrote about this experience and what he learned happened to them. Of all my experiences in the Holocaust, starvation, cruelty, and all the beastly things that I suffered and witnessed in the war, nothing affected my life as much as the knowledge of what happened to my dear mother, sister, and little nephew on that cursed day. The most horrible and unimaginable thing was going to happen to them only 1 hour after I hopefully said goodbye to them, wishing that the war would be over soon and the family would reunite again. What really happened was so out of the sphere of reality that it was unimaginable that such a thing could take place. After the train left the ghetto, they were transferred into a specially designed and sealed truck that piped in carbon monoxide from the exhaust. By the time they arrived in Chelmno, they were all gassed to death. After the war, when I found out how all those people, including my mother, my sister, and her little boy, suffered and died in those gas trucks, I almost lost my mind. Even to this day, it chills my blood that civilized human beings could calculatingly design and build such devices to kill innocent women and children. I am sure that I would not have endured the cruelties and sufferings from that point on if I had known what happened to my beloved sister and nephew. So taking a look just at this picture quickly again, notice the deception. These people are boarding what look like passenger trains, completely deceiving not only them, but the people who are saying goodbye to them. So these deportations continued. Another year passed, Philip and his brother working in the shops, barely eating enough to stay alive. And by 1943, the Russian army was advancing on the Germans. And by April 1944, the Russians were very, very close. In fact, Philip said he could hear the bombings in the distance. As I mentioned, by this time, his entire family was gone, except for his younger brother, Henry. The Germans began to liquidate the camp, the ghetto, and on August 30th, 1944, Philip and his brother Henry left the ghetto by train, thinking they were going to work in Germany. They had been living in the Jewish ghetto for almost 4 years, and Philip was 20 years old by this time. Unfortunately, they arrived here. Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is one of the most iconic and historic pictures from the Holocaust, the entrance to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi extermination camp. Over 1.1 million people were murdered in this extermination camp, including almost 1 million Jews. And the placement of this camp, it was centrally located in Europe to make it easier for the transportation of people to this central location. So you can think of it as basically a killing center. So here's a quick map just to show you where Philip has gone from this point. So now he's at the bottom in Auschwitz, which is where Auschwitz is. And I'd actually like to play a short video clip of Philip describing what it was like for him to arrive at Auschwitz. So I hope you can hear all this. If not, you might need to turn up your volume.
The deception was so that actually the train, what took us to Auschwitz, was a passenger train. The couples screaming, clubs in their hands. They came on the train and screamed out, 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 and they started hitting for no reason. We were completely like in a haze. We came down. We saw a Sessman with dogs shoving and pushing it and making a selection, because that time was still a few older people and some children. We were in a haze, and we saw so many mountains of shoes, mountains of clothing, mountains of eyeglasses. What is that? I mean, mountains of hair. We didn't know what's going on until we found out. We went into a barrack and they took everything off. And they right away said, if you have any gold or hidden something, you know, in the clothing, to tell before we're going to look. If we find it, you're going to get shot. And then the barbers cut out a path in the middle, in the center. They call it the Laus Street, the Lausenstrasse. They gave us a jacket, a striped jacket and pants, and a bowl to get the soup with no utensils.
So a couple of things to mention here. So up until this point, Philip had never heard of something called an extermination camp. You know, he had been inside the ghetto for 4 years. In fact, I remember reading something that he wrote that he actually hadn't had much contact with the Germans, the Nazis, because he had been inside the ghetto for 4 years. No Germans were going inside the ghetto. My grandfather also mentioned the deception of the train. You know, he actually thought they were going into Germany, as I said, to continue working. And before they left, they were made to take apart all the equipment and inside the factories that they were working in. And then finally, the shaved stripe down the center of the head, right? Why would they do that? And this was to make the prisoners easily identifiable as a prisoner. So if they escaped, right, they would potentially be able to change their clothing, but they wouldn't be able to change that stripe in their heads. It was to make them easily identifiable. So here are several pictures of what happened when Philip arrived, right? When you arrive at Auschwitz, the first thing you go through is the selection. And this picture on the top right is showing that selection process. In fact, in the background, you can see the entrance to Auschwitz-Birkenau that I showed you in one of the previous slides. And you can see that the men and women have been separated. And basically now someone is going to choose whether or not they go to the gas chambers or stay in the camp for perhaps slave labor. And the two pictures on the left are the same thing. You can see the Nazi guards examining the people in the pictures. So Philip and Henry, thankfully, were pushed to the same side and were made to march into the camp. They did not go to the gas chambers or the crematoria. They were beaten, pushed, but likely because they could still work. They still looked like they could work. And as they marched, Philip mentioned they saw the mountains of the shoes, the eyeglasses, and the hair. You know, those things are still there at Auschwitz in the memorial. I remember when I visited in 1996, I mean, it's really difficult to see. On this side, you can see an example of the uniform that Philip and the rest of the prisoners were given, the striped uniform. On the bottom right is a group of people waiting in line for the watery soup like my grandfather did. And one thing that my grandfather Philip wrote about, was they always considered whether they should try and get into the front of the line and get the first scoop of the soup. Maybe it would have more, you know, vegetables and nutrients inside of it, or do they wait until the end when maybe everything has sunken down and they get all vegetables instead of just watery soup? You could never judge. Every time it was different. And finally, on the top right, a barracks where people slept. And you can see the bunk beds, which are basically 3 levels, and as many as 6 people slept on each level, just like you can see in this picture, or this picture here of the women's side. And, you know, I mentioned that I visited Auschwitz. I couldn't believe the size of this camp, the number of barracks. This is an older picture here, but like row after row of barracks housing these prisoners. In fact, there were 174 barracks built to house the prisoners. And just to give you a sense of how huge this place was, you know, think of a football field, right? Well, how about 400 football fields? That's how large this killing center was. This is a picture of one of the bathrooms that they were made to use. So Philip said that life in the ghetto was horrible, but at least humane. Life in Auschwitz was completely different. They lived in constant fear for their life, afraid of being beaten to death and shot. Each morning, the Germans would burst into the barracks, screaming, hitting them with clubs, dogs barking them, telling them to get outside and in line. The Nazis would take roll call, and the prisoners would get a very tiny ration of food, stale bread and the watery soup, as I mentioned. And they were constantly dehumanized, pushed, shoved, shouted at, beaten. Days went by like this, and they noticed that every so often, people would get selected to work outside the camp and leave. And Philip and Henry decided that they needed to do whatever it took to get out of this camp, or else they would for sure die in Auschwitz. But at the same time, they wanted to stay together. And as days passed, they kind of observed the selection process and how it worked. And basically, a man came and people lined up, and he would select who he wanted to work. And those people that he selected would be made to take off their clothes, strip naked, and be examined by a doctor. And if they were approved, they would get a red mark and basically leave the camp. So again, Philip and Henry, his brother, wanted to stay together. And so they hatched a plan. They figured out, we got to get out of here. And one day while this process was happening, there was a commotion on the other side of the square. And while everyone's attention was in the other direction, Philip and Henry looked at each other, and without saying a word, they stripped completely naked and ran into the group that had already been selected and was about to be examined by the doctor. They mixed in and nobody saw them. The doctor examined both of them, and they each got the red mark of approval, and they were able to leave Auschwitz. They took their first shower since leaving the ghetto, so 3.5 weeks. And they boarded a cattle car, had no idea where they were going, but it didn't matter. It couldn't be worse than Auschwitz. And after a train ride and a long march, Philip and Henry arrived at a concentration camp, which they learned was called Gross Rosen. They mingled with the other prisoners, trying to get information about their family or acquaintances. That's often what happened the most, to try and figure out if you knew what happened to a family member. He said these conditions were similar to Auschwitz, and they were barely surviving. And after a few days, Philip and the others marched out of the camp to work, cutting down trees in the forest, clearing roadways and railroads, returning to the camp each evening to sleep. And if you didn't work hard enough, you were beaten with batons, and hopefully you would survive that beating and get back to work, or else be shot because you couldn't do the work. In fact, Philip's brother Henry one time was hit so hard on the top of his head that I remember as a kid growing up with seeing Uncle Henry that he still had an indentation on the top of his head where he was beaten. But one day they didn't go to work, and they just stood in line, waiting and waiting for hours and hours. Finally, the gates opened and they were ordered to march. And Philip and the others marched a long way to another camp called Metzbach Tayil, and where Philip by now was 20 years old. And they did similar work here, more roads, trees, ditches, as you can see here in some of these pictures. And they were in constant fear, never knowing when the next beating would come. As the Russian army advanced on the Nazis, Philip and the others were ordered to march again. And while marching, people from other camps joined them as well, and the group grew larger, except for those that weren't able to keep up. Many people died along the way and were just left on the side of the road. Finally, Philip and the group came upon a railroad tracks and were ordered to stop. And after a while, a train of cattle cars arrived. And this is a picture, an example of one of those cattle cars, which, as you can see, is a lot different than those passenger trains that he rode on from Lodz to Auschwitz. No windows, no seats, no toilets. I just imagine an open space in the middle. The Nazis screamed at them, beat them into the cattle cars. And these cattle cars were packed so tight, all of them standing, hundreds of people squished in these cattle cars. Philip and Henry thankfully found a corner. This wasn't their first time in a train, and they found a corner so they could lean against something. The Nazis threw food onto the train, and as Philip described, like we were chickens, throwing food, and people were fighting over the food. After a while, it was too difficult for people to stand, and everyone was just laying on top of each other just to get off of their feet. And if you can, try to imagine yourself like breathing in this environment. What must the smell have been like? The people probably hadn't showered in weeks, and people had to go to the bathroom on the train, and certainly people were dying on the train as well. And they were on this train for several days. Now, I hadn't mentioned this yet, but while at Auschwitz, Philip had found a small piece of metal on the ground, and he had hid it, and he had spent some time carving it into a bit of a tool, which he hid into his jacket. And he used it and cut different things. And thankfully he had that tool, but I'll let him describe in a video what he did with that tool.
In Auschwitz, I found a piece of metal. I sharpened it on a stone and made it so almost I can use it as a knife. And I put it hidden in the side, in my jacket. Nobody should see it. When I lay down on the bottom, little by little, I made that holes, open bigger to get more air in. One morning, we stayed on the ramp, and a passenger train came by because I looked down. I was laying low, and I could see it just by a miracle, the stairs, and I could see people walking down, civilians. And then instinctively, I put my hand out to that little hole. And a man, he put a brown bag in my hand. And it was his lunch. I grabbed it right away, and I did hide it right away to see. I thought I'm hallucinating. It's not true. It was saving our life. My brother Henry and myself survived because of this sandwich, what was given to me by a total stranger.
So Philip went on to say that besides his physical and spiritual thinking was so uplifting, he saw evil all around him, and here a man gave up his lunch to a stranger, a face he didn't even see, just a hand. I'm always amazed by this story and the thought process of the man that gave Philip this sandwich, and Philip reflected on it in his book. And I'd like to read you a short passage in his words. Tears come to my eyes when I thought of that good man. It reinforced in me the belief that despite all the evil around us, there was good in the human makeup and character. As I impulsively reached out my hand for help, the man also instinctively, without time to think, acted nobly, giving up his lunch. Neither of us saw each other's face, yet there was an eternal bond between us. To this day, I think a lot about that man, wondering what kind of a person he was. Did he have a family? Was he German? I wonder if he thought about us, the ones whose lives he saved. I consider this to be one of so many miracles that saved us from dying, because on that train, we were hanging on to life by the last thread. An interesting tidbit actually about this story that I just learned about is this story was selected and included in the USC Shoah Foundation book, Testimony, which is a collection of impactful testimonies from survivors. So I thought that was pretty cool. But the cattle car finally arrived at a different concentration camp called Flossenburg. And they got out of the train, climbing over the people that had died. I've included two pictures from the Flossenburg concentration camp. On the left, you can see the barbed wire pictures, the barbed wire fencing and surrounding the concentration camp. And on the right, you can see the guard towers with the lines of barracks in the distance. And I've included a map as well, so you can see kind of where Philip has gone since leaving Auschwitz. So Philip described Flossenburg as being worse than a labor camp, but not as bad as Auschwitz. But the conditions were awful and many people died. So Philip says that while he had seen a lot of death in the ghetto and a lot of deaths in the camps, but what he saw at Flossenburg was unbelievable. He had seen dead bodies in the ghetto in Auschwitz, but here, and I apologize for the graphic image, bodies of people that had died the night before just piled up naked like human waste, as my grandfather would say. Philip wrote in his book that he started to doubt if he had a chance to survive the war, but what kept him alive was a curiosity to see another day. Philip said that he kept telling his brother that they should hang on, see what the next day will bring, one more sunrise. After a while, Philip and Henry were selected to work outside the camp and went to a satellite concentration camp called Regensburg to work on a destroyed train station. But every time they repaired the tracks, the Allies bombed them again, which meant that they were getting closer. And hopefully Philip and Henry would be saved soon. And that gave them a little hope. After a few more days of the bombings, the guards assembled all the prisoners, and instead of marching to Regensburg to work on the train, they were forced on a death march. So these death marches were massive forced transfers of prisoners from one concentration camp to another, walking long distances, which resulted in numerous deaths. You know, if you couldn't keep up, you were either left behind, beaten, or executed. And just like before, many people died along the way. Philip and the others marched during the night and slept in barns during the day because the Nazis didn't want the normal population to see all these people marching during the day. They thought about trying to escape. Many others had tried, but all were found and killed. And as the march continued, it became more and more difficult to march. And Philip and Henry, they had by now taken off their shoes and wrapped their feet with some cloth. And there was barely enough food to survive, but they could barely walk. And when they couldn't walk any longer, Philip and Henry decided to hide in one of those barns that they were sleeping in. They didn't come out when it was time to leave. But the Nazis found them, and they thought for sure this was the end. But I'll let Philip describe what happened.
It came to a point that we couldn't walk anymore. So we decided that we're going to hide. But they did find us. Me and my brother Henry and others lined us up against the wall to be machine gunned. They started to take up the machine guns down. We started to scream loud, help. I mean, real loud, and everybody picked up the same thing in a big scream, help. So a mother and a daughter in their nightgowns, in their robes, came out, and they screamed to their sisters, "You cannot have any killing on my farm. The Americans are only a mile away from here, and there'll be no killing." And as soon as he turned around, started arguing with them. He says, "I'm the SS officer, I can do it." It was dark, so me and Henry just ran away, ran to the crowd. I mean, and this was the biggest miracle a day before actually the liberation.
So if not for those two women, Philip and Henry would have been gunned down by machine gun. They were lined up against the barn. Nazis were taking down their guns off their shoulders. And Philip looked at his brother and said, "What do we have to lose? Let's just scream help as loud as we can." And thankfully, those two women came out. And as Philip mentioned, it was pitch black. And all of the prisoners that were there in line, ready to be killed, ran back to try and mingle and get back in line with others not to be found. Some people ran to the main part of the line, and Philip, while they were running, he said to his brother, Henry, "Follow me." And they actually ran to the back of the line where the wagons of supplies were. And Philip's thought process was, they would never think that we would go someplace to do more work. So let's go back there. Let's act like we've been helping pushing. They'll never suspect that we were the people that were over there. So by this point, the bombings from the Allied forces were getting closer, and knowing that they would likely be shot soon, Philip and Henry decided to try and escape again. And they decided that the next time the Germans started shooting indiscriminately, they would just jump in a ditch and act like they were dead. And that's exactly what they did. They laid in the ditch for a long, long time, silent, waiting in the cold, watery. It was freezing. It was May 3rd, 1945. And after several hours, they got up and found a place to hide. And on the next day, Friday, May 4th, 1945, one day later, there was a loud knock on the door, and they were found by a German man, except this German man was wearing a white armband and said in German, "Be calm and don't be afraid. The war is over. The Americans are already here." Philip said that he was suspicious of the man at first, not believing that the war was over and that they had actually survived. But the German man smiled and was very nice and spoke using words Philip hadn't heard in a while. He said the man was polite. So Philip's march had ended in a place called Liebenau. and they were taken to a displaced persons camp, which were temporary facilities to hold the survivors of concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people went to these DP camps after the war ended. And at that time, Philip was 21 years old and he weighed 88 pounds. So let me just say that one more time. He was 21 years old and he weighed 88 pounds. After several months of healing and recovery, Philip and his brother were moved to another displaced person in Feldkirchen, displaced persons camp in Feldkirchen. And in Feldkirchen, he met a man named Alter Lipschitz, who my grandfather Philip developed a good relationship with because they both came from similar backgrounds. And while Philip's philosophies on Judaism had changed and his observance had changed since the war, he enjoyed still having these philosophical conversations. And Alter had a niece, and her name was Rosia, later changed to Ruth. And Philip fell deeply in love with her. And a few weeks later, they were married. They were the first couple married in the DP camp, November 24th, 1945. And these are pictures of them not long after the war. Here's another picture of them with a friend enjoying a soccer game. And another picture of Philip and Ruth with Philip's brother Henry and his wife, who also happens to be named Ruth. And so Philip and Ruth moved around to several other DP camps. And about a year and a half later, on April 24th, 1947, Ruth had a baby, my father, Abraham, or Alan. And now we come full circle to the beginning of Philip's third life, right? That I showed you these pictures. On the left, you see again the picture of them going to Bremen Port to go to America. It took them a while to actually get a ticket to the US. It wasn't so easy. But in March 1950, they made their way to Bremen Port and boarded this boat that you see here on the right, the General W.C. Langfit. The boat first went to Venezuela, then to Venezuela. Actually, it was Passover, and they actually brought kosher for Passover food onto the boat so the Jews could celebrate Passover. And then they went to New Orleans and finally New York City, where, as you can imagine, Philip coming from this tiny village and seeing all these giant buildings in Manhattan and New York City. The other thing I remember him talking about was just how dirty New York City was. And a day later, Philip and Ruth and Alan took a train from Grand Central to Toledo, Ohio to live with relatives. And Philip and Ruth had two more children, Sylvia and Diane. And as I mentioned before, Philip opened a successful television and appliance store. So, well, I'm so lucky to have had them as grandparents. And I'm so lucky to have this opportunity to be here to do this. It's unfortunately that I do. But we need to remember that this happened. We need to remember that the Holocaust was not perpetrated by primitive people in a fit of passion or in an unseen corner of the globe against enemies or strangers, but by Germany, a country that at the time was the leader of intellectual, scientific, artistic, and philosophical thought at the time. The engineers and architects designed the gas chambers in concentration camps. The chemists created the poison gas for murder. Logistics experts organized the cattle car transports to the death camps. Physicians made selections between those who would go to the gas chambers and crematoria or work as slave laborers, let alone the medical experiments. Politicians made the laws, and they documented all of it with meticulous detail. So what would my grandfather Philip want you to learn from this presentation? That you should know what happened, know that it actually did happen, and study it. Learn the reasons for what happened, how it came about. The world, as my grandfather would say, stood by and watched. Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And that is why we must never forget. So thank you all so much for being here to listen. I hope you find this story as moving as I do. Thank you again to the Berger family for sponsoring this event in memory of Simon Berger. And thank you to 3GNY for providing me with this opportunity to tell the story. This is a cover of Philip's book. And yeah, thank you again. I think perhaps there are some questions. I'd be more than happy to answer those. But again, thank you for listening.
Steven, thank you so much for gifting us with your family story. As Stephen just said, we're now going to open it up for questions. If you have a question for Stephen, please put it in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to address it. If we don't get to your question, please email info@3gnewyork.org and we'll get back to you later on. I want to start with a comment from Karen Salver. She says, I met Philip Markowicz. We also emailed each other, a wonderful human being. I bought 3 copies of his book, which he inscribed. And on the topic of his book, I was wondering, I want to read this book. Can we get a copy? What's going on with the book?
Yeah, good question. So I have a copy here, and it's inscribed as well. But so it is out of print, but we are working on getting it back in print with the University of Toledo. So stay tuned, but it should be hopefully reprinted in the near future.
Thanks, Stephen. That story was amazing and very powerful. A couple of people want to know about how it is sharing with students. How have the students reacted to your grandfather's story? And did they ask any questions that you weren't expecting or surprised by?
Yeah, I mean, it's been deeply fulfilling to speak to the students about this topic and this story. The first time I did it was with my son's 5th grade Hebrew school class. And I've kind of progressed from that, doing a variety of different ages, both younger and also, older students in 9th and 10th grade. I think all of them they appreciate hearing, the live story, like a true story of someone who went through it. It's much different than just, learning that something actually happened in history books as you typically do in school. And I mean, I don't think there's any questions that I didn't expect, but I think I appreciate all the questions because I can I can tell by the questions that they're asking that they're really taking in the material and it's affecting them.
You had a lot of great photos. Could you talk about how you got all of those photos?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, for my family, I only have those couple photos of them from Germany historically, but the other photos that were basically found through a lot of research online and really looking for things that matched up in the places to where Philip was. And I spent a lot of time going through pictures, trying to identify like specific places that he was at that time. And I thought for me, it really helped. And it helps kind of push the presentation along and just gives you like a really sense of what it was like being there.
Did your grandfather ever talk about forgiveness, and was he able to summon the will to forgive his tormentors?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it took a long time. Yeah, I don't know if forgive is maybe the right word, but I think, after a long time, I think he made peace with everything, and I think a lot of that came probably with talking about it, and doing similar conversations that I'm having and being able to teach other people about it. So, yeah.
This question is from Dawn Siff. She said that she's your cousin on the other side, and she knew your grandfather too. The most extraordinary, kind, and brilliant man. And she's asking you if you could tell us more about speaking at the schools and what grades you speak to. She says, in our neighborhood public schools, there are not a lot of Jewish kids, so we believe this is really needed.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Don. Thanks for the question. Hi, and hi, all other family. So it's been great speaking at the schools, and 3GNY, the whole purpose, one of the main purposes of 3GNY is to speak at schools and be matched at various places that want speakers like us. For me personally, I have done sort of 5th, 6th grade, 7th grade. I've done 10th grade several times. I've also spoken at JTS. And I think, again, there's a ton of people at 3GNY that have done very similar things as well, and we continue to do so. But Dawn, I would love to get in touch with you and have more contact. I'm sure we can get involved with the school and figure out a way to find some opportunities, whether it's me or one of the other people in 3GNY to speak there.
Another question is, when did your grandfather start telling and sharing his story?
Yeah, so so when they first came to America, they actually did their best to not talk about this at all. They lived completely secular lives. Of course, they were Jewish, but they didn't talk about this. They didn't talk about this with their children. And, I think as the children started getting older, I think they realized, something was a little different about their parents compared to everyone else. And they encouraged my grandfather to speak. So that's sort of when he started. And I think there was a little bit of a break. And I remember inviting him to speak to my junior high, my 7th and 8th grade class in Toledo. And that was a great experience in an auditorium. And so I think it's been going on for quite a while. And again, once he got a little bit older and it was sort of hard to summon the energy to continue talking about this, my mom started doing it, and she does an excellent job in the Toledo, Ohio and Northwest Ohio area. So I'm just kind of happy to keep, to take the torch.
As I know you're a 3G and your kids are a little older, old enough to learn, this story. So how is it telling it to them and sharing this with them? And have they had a chance to meet your grandfather?
Yes. So first I'll start with the last question. Yes, they did get a chance to meet him. They several years and many years with him. So I have wonderful pictures of them with him. It's really great. So my son Gavin loves history. And so he loves learning about all this stuff and has definitely had a curiosity. He's been wanting to read this book for quite a while. And I'm like, not yet. It's a little too much for you right now. But he knows a lot of the story. In fact, for his history class, when they were working on an immigration story, he interviewed my dad, my father, about his experience, if you remember, coming to America. And then he also put together a 5 to 7 7-page PowerPoint presentation where he went through his great grandfather's story. So he's the first 4G that's talking about his story in class.
A couple of people want to know, what was it like going back to Poland, and any advice you have for anyone who's looking to go back or go visit the camps?
Yeah, I went in 1996 on a US-wide Poland-Israel trip, and actually met my wife on that trip. So it was deeply meaningful for a variety of reasons. We did go to Auschwitz-Birkenau. I did not go to his hometown, the village. That was not on the itinerary. But it was deeply meaningful to be there, especially being at a place where he specifically was. As difficult as it is, I encourage everyone to see it. It's something that needs to be seen and remembered and told. So I definitely recommend going, but it's hard. It's really hard.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you everyone for your questions. And again, feel free to email us at info@3gnewyork.org if you want Steven to answer the questions if we didn't address it tonight. Steven, thank you so much for speaking and sharing your grandfather's story. We're really grateful to have you on our board and helping lead 3GNY as well. Thank you to Bella for being part of our program and being so valuable to 3GNY. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. We're glad you took the time to hear Steven speak words that must never be forgotten. If you haven't yet made a gift to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat for ways you can donate. Thank you. Also, if you have connections with educators who may want our speakers to present to their classes, please let us know. We have a large speakers bureau of hundreds of grandchildren prepared and ready to present, just like you saw Steven do tonight. We're also very excited to announce our first in-person event in over 2 years, which will be a happy hour gathering on Wednesday, May 25th at Hidden Lane Bar in Manhattan. We're looking forward to seeing each other in person. Many of us who we've met virtually over the past 2 years have never met in real life. So we hope to see many of you there as we convene our community. There's going to be some other events coming up, and we'll send an email out with more information. You can check out some of our past We Do Wednesdays and events on our YouTube channel. And thank you again for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. We're grateful as always for your presence and support.